Good afternoon and welcome to all attendees to this webinar on policy and planning considerations for energy and electricity in South Africa in the years to 2050. My name is Chris Yelland, Managing Director at EE Business Intelligence, and I'll be your host at this webinar, signed in from Johannesburg. Welcome also to our presenters, who will be introduced to you in due course. I will now share a link with you in the Zoom chat facility where you can download the presenter biographies. So please take a look at the Zoom chat facility. And welcome to you, the attendees, for your interest and participation. This webinar is hosted by EE Business Intelligence. I'd like to acknowledge and thank Meridian Economics, Presidential Climate Commission, the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies, that's the CRSES at Stellenbosch University, and the Policy Research in International Services and Manufacturing Center, PRISM, of the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town, and finally to Clyde Mallinson himself for your valued support for this webinar and for the great work that you do in this field. And finally, I would like to thank Mr. Subesh Pillay, who is the new Acting Director General at the Ministry of Energy and Electricity, for the opening address that he'll give us today. Subesh is well known in the local, provincial, and national government sectors, but perhaps less well known to the wider electricity and energy sector, and this audience in particular. So this webinar provides a unique opportunity for us to meet Subesh, get to know him, hear his thoughts and insights on policy and planning for electricity, and indeed for the wider energy sector and subsectors in South Africa for the years to 2050. More than 1,600 delegates have registered to attend this webinar to hear what Subesh and the presenters have to say on the subject. This attests to the relevance of the subject matter being covered and the stature of the acting DG and all the presenters. So may I thank you, Subesh, and to the presenters for your participation and for the time and effort that you've put in. Please do note that this webinar is being recorded, and links to view the webinar on demand and to download all the presentations will be made available tomorrow morning to all those who registered to attend, as well as publicly. Colleagues, this webinar will cover policy and planning considerations for energy and electricity in South Africa in the years to 2050. In particular, the webinar will constructively analyze the Draft Integrated Resource Plan for Electricity, also known as Draft IRP 2025. The Draft IRP is currently undergoing a formal consultation process at NEDLAC, involving government, business, labor, and communities. Thereafter, the Draft IRP will be submitted to the Cabinet for policy adjustment, and then finalisation and publishing in the Government Gazette. Now, people have asked me, so why have this webinar now? Is it appropriate and is it relevant to be discussing the IRP at this time, whilst it's sitting before NEDLAC? Well, my answer is that an IRP for electricity is said to be a living plan that needs to be regularly updated every couple of years, and not every 6 to 8 years, as has been the case for the last two integrated resource plans for electricity. Furthermore, the IRP for electricity should be developed to align with an overall national integrated energy plan, the so-called IEP, and not vice versa. But the IEP is still work in progress and is only expected to be finalized sometime next year. So, in my view, techno, socio, and economic research, studies, modeling, and engagement on energy and electricity planning should be taking place on an ongoing basis all the time, including now. This work is a continuous process and not an event. And I hope that this webinar will add to the engagements in a constructive way for the benefit of South Africa. The program for the day has been widely circulated, but a link to download the program will be shared again now on the Zoom chat facility, so please take a look there. So first, we're going to have an opening address by Subesh Pillay. Then our 4 expert presenters will each give a 20-minute presentation. And in between, we will have a 10-minute comfort break. Thereafter, Professor Harold Winkler from UCT will wrap up with some insights of his own. And after this, we've set aside about 30 minutes for our presenters to answer just some of your questions in an open discussion and Q&A session. Whilst the presentation is in progress, please do send your questions on the Zoom Q&A text facility and not on the chat facility. You may also put up your hands to ask questions verbally. So without further ado, I will now introduce our opening speaker, who is, as I say, Subesh Pillay, who will deliver the opening address. But first, may I introduce Subesh. So after serving as Chief of Staff in the Ministry of the Presidency for Electricity, Subesh was appointed acting DG in the new Ministry of Energy and Electricity on the 1st of April 2025. He has 30 years of experience in the South African public sector, working across all 3 spheres of government. His experience includes municipal finance, infrastructure provisioning, spatial planning, and economic development, energy, electricity, both generation, transmission, and distribution, as well as renewables. He has served as MMC for infrastructure planning and economic development, and has been a member of the NEC of SALGA, where he chaired the National Working Group on Municipal Finance. In the Gauteng legislature, he was the MEC for Economic Development, Agriculture, and Rural Development. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce to you Subesh Pillay. Subesh, if you can switch on your camera and microphone, and the floor is yours.
Okay. Good afternoon, colleagues. Thanks, Mike, Chris, for a glowing introduction. Just to correct, I was not the MEC for Economic Development. I worked in the office of the MEC, of course. But thank you very much, colleagues, and it's a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I think when Mike pitched the idea of me opening, we had initially had other ideas about who should do this, and then he suggested that, I mean, for reasons he's explained, it would be more appropriate. In my mind, at the point, I imagined a room of about 20 people. I think by the day before yesterday in the afternoon, he was telling me figures in the order of about 1,400 people. So clearly a very prominent audience, and it's my great privilege and pleasure to be with you this afternoon and be opening this address as we continue the dialogue about energy planning in South Africa. I think maybe just notably to say that, and I'm sure many colleagues in the room will attest, that as we take this conversation almost as a moment of inflection from where we come from an energy perspective, I think the one sort of relief, if you like, is the fact that unlike many discussions on this topic over the past decade, which has been dominated by nomenclature of scarcity, emergency generation, deficits, load shedding, in many ways, have become a defining characteristics of our energy experience. And I mean, we are beginning to see a change. I think yesterday somebody described it as a structural end to load shedding. Now, for the many energy experts in the room, I think you'll make your own mind about what that means. But I mean, I do think there is a significant difference in the manner in which, or the conditions under which we take in this conversation. And principle is that we've seen a marked improvement in the generation capacity, and I'll talk to that in a second. But more importantly, what the opportunity and the moment has occasioned is an ability to begin to enter into this conversation, not from the realm of the immediacy of a crisis, but from the prism of long-term thinking, strategic planning, borrowing from international best practice, evidence-based planning, conceptually around how we design and then follow a path of energy security in our country. So I mean, I do think it's an appropriate moment to take this this conversation. I also, I mean, the fact that on Monday, Eskom would have released the winter outlook. And again, that winter outlook begins to send a very clear signal that we have made a marked departure from the immediate crisis that we've been faced with over a prolonged period of time, over 2-3 years, at least this iteration of it. And what we've seen in the recent past, of course, is a period of about 9 months of uninterrupted power supply from about June last year into March of this year. Of course, we had 3 bouts of load shedding early on in this year. But by and large, we've had a steady supply of electricity. There are issues relating to load reduction that deals with a very different kind of problem. But in the main, the energy system, generation system, has stabilized significantly, at least relative to where we were 3 years ago. And I must say that it's not a benchmark, because we know the system was not in a great shape to start off with. But we are making amends, and I think the movement is what we're attempting to acknowledge. Just from the generation system point of view, when we came in, when the minister was appointed in 2023, you had unplanned losses in the order of about 18,000 megawatts early in 23, and we've now stabilized that to about 12.1. I mean, there are periods when we breached below the 10,000 mark, but it continues to hover in that order of about 12,000 megawatts as of April. The energy availability factor, and I know this is one that Chris keeps us on our toes around, year on year has settled around 61%. We've obviously, I think we've not made no secret about it. The recent months have not been easy, but on average, year on year, 61% is where we were. And I think what that means is that the target of 65 to 70% is now firmly in sight, and all indications are that we will be able to breach into the 65% mark as we head ultimately into a sort of 70% target. Again, by any standard, not an ideal for a growing economy. You want to edge ever closer to that 80% mark. But I mean, again, given where we're coming from, we do think that this represents a significant movement forward. And then, of course, there's this whole debate about coal and the use of diesel. Well, coal as well, but diesel in particular for this point. And I mean, all of this, the improvements has also seen a reduction in the amount of diesel that we've burnt over that period, year on year. And I mean, what that says is that this approach has really not been, it has been structural in terms of the generation system, and we haven't relied significantly on diesel. Of course, the peakers will continue to have a role to play in our energy system, but I think the significant point that we're making here is that we've been able to stabilize the extent to which we call upon the peakers outside of what they plan for the peak demand periods. And of course, over the past 2 years, we've seen the 3 units at Kusile return from long outages. We've seen Unit 6 being synchronized. Koeberg has come back. Unit 1 has come back online. We do know that Unit 2 went out in that intervening period, but we are beginning to see a much better stabilization as a result of these units coming back on. And of course, Kusile Unit 4 is poised to come back after also a prolonged outage in the next couple of weeks. And what, as I say, what all of this means is that we're now able to break from a constant of merely managing a deficit or a shortfall in the demand relative to demand, but we have the opportunity, responsibility, and probably more critically, an obligation to reposition our planning focus, so to think structurally, not symptomatically, and to plan not just for continuity, but for inclusive growth and transformation. So, you know, we do make the point about the energy availability factor, and we're quite conscious that we are perhaps dealing, not perhaps, we're certainly dealing with subdued growth as a result of broader economic issues. And so if everything else that's happening in the governance ecosystem works, and we have no option but to make it to work, that is going to put pressure on demand. And if we're saying we want to follow an energy, an industrial intensive growth, that certainly is going to push up demand, and we need to be thinking very critically about how in that growth period we are able to ensure that there's a balance between demand and supply. So I guess the question that you're confronting, and certainly a question that in the ministry and the department and the broader energy family we're confronting, is what kind of an energy system do we want to build between now and 2050 that gives us the resilience that we want to build, and that is able, in fact, to power this growth, inclusive growth that we want to do, follow. Industrial expansion program, and of course, quite critically, to how we deal in all of that as an underlying layer, foundational layer, how we deal with issues of climate resilience. So in a sense, from a crisis management to more long-term institutional planning. And to do that, you really need to understand what brought us here. So that root cause analysis and diagnostic of what got us here. And I'll not spend a lot of time. I think that's a fairly well-documented position, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time. I mean, suffice to say that we have to be honest about the deficiencies that we've experienced in the energy sector, and characterized or shaped by a toxic interplay of deferred infrastructure investments, gaps between policy delivery and systemic governance inertia, generational capacity consistently lagging growing demand, high rates of urbanization, and all of this while the declining performance of Eskom's aging fleet exposed probably deeper operational and institutional vulnerabilities. And then, of course, we have the renewable energy procurement process, initially marked by regulatory delays, indecisive market reforms, and all of this further compounded the supply side capability and left us exposed to unplanned breakdowns, as well stated. So beyond these operational constraints, of course, lies the deeper structural issues, the fragmentation of our energy planning system. And Chris, I think you made the point at the beginning very eloquently that we have an IRP, which served as our main electricity planning instrument, but it's also been inconsistently updated. There's been limited integration between the electricity planning through the IRP, industrial policy planning at other levels of government, including the provinces and municipalities, and how our climate goals got to be incorporated in all of that. And of course, again, as you make the point, Chris, compounding all of this is the fact that the integrated energy plan had not been initiated or finalized. So really, you'd looked at energy planning as a sector-based planning document, focused narrowly on the electricity sector, really to the exclusion of how it's impacted upon by other elements, including liquid fuels, the gas master plan, energy efficiency or demand side management. And none of this was properly integrated. And of course, this lack of a coherent framework undermined in many regards investor confidence, both in generation and transmission infrastructure projects, It undermined municipal viability. We know that municipalities continue to experience, well, both municipalities and Eskom as distributors continue to experience distribution losses, and it's just unsustainable. Consumer debt continues to escalate. And then you've had this period of policy legitimacy as citizens began to experience and feel the effects of the state incapacity firsthand. And so this is the kind of environment that we had to contend with. And then in spite of all of this, I guess there are lessons that you would draw, having acknowledged these weaknesses, these deficits. And what it's revealed is that not only the weaknesses in our infrastructure, but also the institutional design flaws in how we govern the energy system. And in a planning regime that is too slow to evolve, we know that innovation has been moving dramatically. And if we're not able to meet the demands of a changing energy economy, particularly one that's shaped by decentralized generation, digital grids, global decarbonization imperatives, we'll continue to be on the back end of a sustainable and resilient energy system. The most recent iteration, again, Chris, you've talked to where the process is, but the most recent iteration of the IRP reflects a commitment to a more robust and dynamic modeling, stronger integration with industrial policy, better alignment with both the transmission development plan, but also the spatial realities and the evolving spatial realities in the major urban centers and what that does for energy demand. The gas master plan, also another element of the integrated energy plan, again, also delayed considerably now in advanced stages. We're likely to issue soon the gas master plan for the first phase of public participation. But similarly pivotal, providing a platform to define how the role of gas in South Africa's transition pathways, and how we mitigate what is now emerging as a so-called gas cliff. But I think for gas, much like the electricity system, how we enable regional integration and integration of energy markets across the continent, and in particular in the SADC region. So together, these instruments are helping us lay the groundwork for a more integrated, anticipatory, and responsive planning ecosystem. But until the IEP is finalized and the various planning instruments are nested under a common strategic agenda, the risk of fragmentation remains. And I guess the takeaway from all of this is that energy planning must be more than a static document updated every few years. It has to be institutionalized, it must be continuous, it must be cross-sectoral, it must integrate the developmental processes across the realm of government and society, and one that ultimately is technically robust, that is politically, that is buy-in politically, and that is critically socially inclusive. It's one thing to have energy security. It's another thing that energy is not affordable to an average South African. So it's almost self-defeating in that sense. Just a moment, just to pause here. I think yesterday we had an interesting conversation with the Energy Council around how we're panning out and finalizing the IEP. I think, Chris, you did make the point, we're expecting between a 14 to 16-month process to bring the IEP to close. Out of our experience of the IRP, we have very consciously decided that the two things. Firstly, is the front loading of what we put out into the public. It has to be a credible document. So we can't put out something whimsy and flimsy and then hope that it gets to be path corrected and right-sized in the public participation process. Up front, the document must reflect the seriousness of government and the intention of government to use energy, both to meet our decarbonization objectives, but also critically to meet our growth and development objectives. And so for that purpose, so that's the first principle. The second principle is that the engagement with key stakeholders up front is critical. I think, the experience of the IRP is that we we almost treated all stakeholders equally. So it was just a free-for-all commenting process. And ultimately, when we did wrestle control of the IRP process, we realized of the multiples of comments received, and I'm not suggesting for one moment those be discarded, but it's important that we put the key role players in the room and at least get a consensus on what the broad framework must be, that should be articulated, the key principles that must be articulated in the IRP. So we will design a process that's a bit more, substantially more credible, robust, and obviously characterized by a great deal more of integrity. As we move from recovery to redesign, and we accept that the energy sector is a sector in transition, of course, we stand at a critical junction, one that's not defined by recovery of generation performance, but by the structural evolution of South Africa's electricity system itself. Although, I mean, operationally, the turnaround Eskom marks a notable shift, these improvements, as we've made the point, are not cosmetics, they are structural, they are making changes. I mean, the changes are reflecting both in the operational and financial performance of the entity. But the electricity sector is no longer defined solely by Eskom, and I think this is the critical point. The unbundling is now underway. We know that the National Transmission Company of South Africa, the NTCSA, the pending activation and initiation of the competitive electricity market under ERA means that we're entering a fundamentally new planning and market environment. The operationalization of the NTCSA and the release, the hopefully imminent release of a new grid access rules by the regulator are also early indications of this shift. And we've learned from countries like Vietnam, Chile, who've transitioned to competitive markets with significant private sector participation, which offers us a global benchmark that we can work towards. And of course, this requires the recalibration of our policy instruments, regulatory architectures, our institutional mandates, and almost demands a new planning paradigm, and one that integrates our public and private investment flows across the energy ecosystem, generation, transmission, distribution, multiple governance levels, including municipalities, the provinces, again, as I made the point, SADC-wide integration to allow for appropriate trade flows, and a whole of systems approach that treats transmission infrastructure and locally embedded generation, demand-side management, battery storage as interconnected elements, not as siloed approaches or functions. And this is our moment to shift from a reactive management to strategic redesign, to reshape the sector, not just for reliability, but for justice, flexibility, and critical future-proofing our energy system. If the last decade has taught us the dangers of deferred decisions, then the road to 2050 must be built on a deliberate, evidence-based, future-fit planning choices. We can't afford to drift into a future and hope for the best. We must envision what that future looks like, and we must meticulously design the pathway to get us there. I want to, as I move towards closure, Chris, just offer 5 areas that I think would be critical. The first is to think about energy security, not as a narrow concept, but as a developmental imperative. So to design a resilient energy mix, combining variable renewable energy sources, gas, clean, coal technologies, nuclear, and storage based on a diversified domestic and on domestic sources. Plan for reserves and redundancies so that we're not exposed to climatic, geopolitical, and technical shocks. We've seen what happened in the Ukraine with the Ukraine-Russia war in terms of gas. And we've seen incidences across the global ecosystem and the lessons to be drawn out of that. And then to embed regional integration, strategic projects like the gas line, the South Africa Mozambique gas pipeline, the SADC power pool are all important areas of work that we must not lose sight of as we define for ourselves as a country what our energy system should be looking at. The second one is around decarbonization, and the point here we make is that decarbonization absolutely, but without destabilization. So the plan, the coal assets repurposing alongside industrial reconversions, and not a summary one-side closure policy. We must begin to look at other CCUS, carbon capture and utilization storage systems. We must begin to look at nuclear with renewed energy, and the SMRs, small modular reactors, offers a significant opportunity and potential. And then to uphold a differentiated pathway reflecting South Africa's development realities and our commitments, our absolute commitments to a just energy transition, codified in what we've designed and committed to as an NDC nationally determined contribution, set of contributions. The third area is around a fit-for-purpose distribution center. And I think maybe not here, but certainly in the course of the conversations, we have to pay now particular and focused attention on the distribution sector. I think we've done sufficient work on generation. We're beginning to grapple with the transmission system. And I think what is critical now is that we look at the distribution system and recognize that municipal losses continue to grow. The last figure I've seen is in all of about 15 billion, which undermines financial viability. It's particularly municipalities, but Eskom is not out of the equation there. To plan for EDI, electricity distribution industry restructuring, to enable regional distributors with governance and technical scale, and then to prepare for new interfaces. This includes rooftop solar, microgrids, bidirectional power flows, and demand-side markets. And the fourth area is around flexibility, technology, and digitalization. And I think we've fallen horribly back in this on the score. We must integrate grid forming technologies to replicate inertia and stabilize voltage. That's going to help us avoid the kind of things as we scale up renewables, avoid the kind of incidents that unfortunately the Spanish experienced a couple of days ago. But it certainly calls upon us to think more critically about how we manage the interface. We must expand our battery storage capabilities, smart grids, real-time digital dispatching systems. And then thirdly, to leverage platforms like Eskom's virtual winning platforms and the AI-based forecasting. Minister, well, off the back of the NERSA publication, Minister yesterday took time to explain what that means, the wheeling framework. Of course, you still have to go through the municipal process, but it does begin to signal a greater sense of urgency around how we engage with the completeness of what the energy system is able to produce. And then fifth and finally, is planning as a lever for industrial and geopolitical positioning. And here, it's about linking our energy policy to a new industrial base. This includes green hydrogen, of course, battery minerals, local manufacturing, service exports. We must drive inclusion as we do all of this work to ensure that women, young people in particular, marginalized communities must be producers and not just consumers. And then finally, that both through the multilateral forums like the G20, which we currently chair, the Green Hydrogen Alliance, which Minister chairs, but in other platforms across the continent and globally, South Africa begins to reposition and reoccupy a position of leadership in the energy ecosystem. And then I think maybe just the last point I want to make is around the governance issues, and that is the ability to build institutions, governance institutions, that not only is able to direct this plan, design the plan, but also critically able to execute the plan. And it will depend on whether we have the institutional capabilities, the governance, regulatory coherence to plan, to take this plan forward from ideas to ultimately to investments, from decision to delivery. And around the institutional planning, there has to be policy certainty, regulatory clarity. We must build critically a capable and coordinated state. Part of the discussion that we're taking with the Energy Council yesterday was just how, in light of the fact that you now have a Department of Electricity and Energy, what are the technical and managerial capacities required both at head office, in the provinces, across municipalities? How do we improve the coordination across spheres with Eskom, the IPPs, and the regulator, institutionalize planning both through the IDP process and the DDM model, and within the financing and fiscal arrangements of the state. I think as we look forward to 2050, let's not make the mistake of assuming that energy planning is merely a technocratic exercise. At its core, it's a nation-building endeavor, one that speaks to what kind of energy economy we want to build, what kind of energy system and therefore economy we want to build, what kind of society we aspire to, and what kind of future ultimately we want to leave behind for posterity. Planning decisions we make today will either entrench inequality or will enable opportunity. They will either perpetuate the fragility or it will unlock resilience, and will either leave us reacting to a crisis after crisis, or put us in a position where, as a developmental state, that we're able to anticipate and shape our own destiny. So, colleagues, I think with that bit of short words, may I wish you a successful webinar rather, not only one that integrates models and assumptions, but also challenges the institutions, expand inclusion, and catalyze leadership required to deliver an energy future that South Africa and the continent deserves. Thank you very much, Chris, and to the colleagues online. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Subesh. You have articulated exactly what I hoped you would articulate, a broad overview of energy policy and planning, not just electricity, but across the whole energy spectrum. And I think I have met you now, I would say, and started to meet you for the first time. It's been a pleasure to hear you speak, to hear your views. And my impressions are a person who can really articulate clearly the requirements without sugarcoating, a very frank assessment of our weaknesses, our failings, and also our opportunities and strengths, and the way forward as we move from crisis management to a more resilient system where we can become more strategic in the approach to planning away from crisis management. So I think you've given us a lot to think about. It's been an absolute privilege to have you do this opening presentation, and thank you for the time and your presence. I know you do have to run off. Hopefully you can maybe listen to one or two of the presentations, but we understand fully how busy your life must be in the energy environment that you've explained to us. So thanks again, Subesh. And I would like to now then move to our first main presenter, in the sense of a proper, substantial, in-depth look at the integrated resource plan, as opposed to a broad overview of the energy environment, which Subesh has given us so competently. So may I introduce to you Dr. Javier Steyn, of Meridian Economics. He's generally well known to the industry sector. Javier is the founding partner and managing director at Meridian Economics, specializing in infrastructure regulation, policy, and restructuring. He combines high-level strategic insight with strong economic and financial analytical skills. He takes interest in the economic and institutional complexities of developing infrastructure and appreciates the challenge of aligning the stakeholder perspectives of investors, financiers, service users, policymakers, and regulators. He has served on President Ramaphosa's Economic Advisory Council and was a member of the President's Eskom Sustainability Task Team. Javier has a Master of Engineering degree in Energy Studies from the UCT, University of Cape Town, and a PhD in Economics from Sussex University. Javier, thank you for joining us, and over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Chris, and good afternoon to the many colleagues I see online. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to share with you all some of the reflections we have at Meridian about our energy planning, in particular the IRP process. I think what we're going to do today is, from our side, we're not really going to talk much about the technical details and the assumptions, etc. In the IRP process. We are going to make some broader comments about the IRP planning process and documents based on our quite extensive involvement in the process so far. So I think it is useful to say that we do come from a position of a perspective of being reasonably close to the process. We've attended many of the workshops, etc. We've also done our own technical modeling for an IRP type analysis, which we published last year, and you can find online. And perhaps just reflecting on what we heard Subesh say now, I mean, with a new Department of Electricity and Energy, a new team coming in, I think this is a great opportunity to reflect on the IRP process. So we've been brave. We're going to make some critical comments. We're offering them in a constructive mode because this is a great opportunity to actually, in line with the comments we've just heard made by the acting DG, to actually improve the way the IRP works. So let's perhaps just start by talking about the role of the IRP and why getting it right is so important. Firstly, what is the IRP? It's actually interesting to recognize that the IRP is defined in law. It's essentially our primary electricity generation policy statement that specifies the types of energy sources and technologies from which electricity may be generated, and importantly, as to indicate the amount of electricity that is to be generated from each of these sources. And we'll come back to this definition because it's an important part of it. A broader part of the legal context, of course, that it speaks to policy making in South Africa, is that policy making by the executive is subject to the constitutional principle of legality, which essentially requires a minimum level of rationality. There's a minimum rationality requirement of policy making, and that if policies are not essentially rationally connected to its stated purpose, policies can be overturned by our courts. So this is an important part of the context for any policy that's made in our country. So why is getting the IRP right so important? In a nutshell, and with a bit more of a narrow focus perhaps, the IRP is critical for efficient public procurement, but also for private investment in the sector and in electricity consuming activities. The public procurement for power requires an IRP. Most flexible dispatchable generation capacity will most likely be procured publicly in future, and this includes gas and batteries. And also importantly, at least for the foreseeable future, until we have the wholesale market working, which is likely to take quite a while, particularly for the capacity-based resources. Also, nuclear and pump storage will most likely be publicly procured for the foreseeable future, particularly because nuclear isn't yet a commercially viable technology, given the competition that it has. These costs, the cost of this public procurement, will of course be imposed on all electricity consumers, whether you are buying your electricity from private generators or not. So this is an important aspect for all of us. Procurement is governed by Section 34 of the Electricity Regulation Act, as we all know, which specifically says the minister must have regard to the content of the integrated resource plan. So the IRP shapes what is procured by government. The IRP, as I said, also is very important for for private sector investment in the sector. A coherent, rational, predictable policy framework helps create investor confidence that's necessary to see the investment that we need. It's worth reminding ourselves how critical electricity is to all economic activity. The entire economy uses electricity. For the last 17 years, of course, we've had massive supply side shocks in our economy with load shedding and a 280% real increase in Eskom tariffs, which of course has an undeniable negative impact on economic growth and employment. And I think it is this what Subesh was talking about, that this is what we need to be turning around. So the key point here is that power sector efficiency is critical. It's not just security of supply. It's doing it it's doing that, but also in an affordable way. The best case model scenarios that we all look at these days shows that tariffs are likely to have to increase further as the old Eskom power stations are retired. So least cost power system planning matters greatly. And why then is doing modeled optimizer-based analysis so important and doing it right? That, of course, is because the stakes are very high. Securing a reliable supply at the lowest possible economic and environmental cost is one of the most critical challenges in supporting our long-term economic development. This challenge is immensely complex and requires rigorous analysis, and there's too much to do this by just trying to keep it all in your head. We need a systematic modeling approach to help us do this. Capacity expansion simulation models process millions of variables and constraints to determine optimal technology investments for a given set of input assumptions. And given the challenges of uncertainty and the long-term nature over which this planning happens, we of course need to use these models to do effective scenario planning to help us develop resilient energy planning. So what does a credible IRP require in terms of its process? Firstly, very importantly, outcomes must follow logically from the results of proper analysis. Outcomes have to be evidence-based. It should be grounded in sound, transparent, and well-documented techno-economic analysis. And this is the critical issue. So the test must be, will any other energy planner make similar reasonable assumptions arrive at similar results? Will my results be replicable by others? Can others roughly come to the same conclusions if they follow the same reasonable process? This is a key requirement. Further, we often hear about policy adjustments. From an economic point of view, it's really important to understand that policy adjustments is not a free get-out-of-jail card for special interests, right? Any adjustment or constraint that forces deviation from an optimized plan imposes further costs on the economy, further costs on the challenges with creating jobs and employment, etc. We need to actually go and quantify if there is a real desperate need for policy adjustment that hasn't yet been accommodated in the modeling. The first question is, why can't we accommodate it in the modeling? If it's not accommodated, we still need to go and quantify whether policy adjustments really bring greater benefits and at what cost. This cost-benefit trade-off is critical and must be made visible and clear. There is no free lunch. It only appears so, of course, when the costs are hidden or imposed onto others. A further critical requirement is that the IRP, and we heard this from the acting DG, must be consistent with other policy frameworks. In particular, we have climate commitments, we have local air quality regulations, we have broader socio-economic goals. And that's, of course, important, that we test whether our energy policies and our electricity policies meet our other objectives. A credible process must involve meaningful consultation and technical review. We've heard, again, the acting DG talk about this. We need clear and transparent assumptions and scenario design. Stakeholder engagements needs to happen earlier on. It's no point taking a fait accompli to stakeholders, including technical experts, and then expecting them to comment on the scenario design or the input assumptions, etc., because it's too late in the day. The modeling has been done, the cabinet is waiting for the report. That doesn't work. International experience and precedent shows that you need to have a consultation process right from the start, and as you reach the different gates or steps in the process, that there is meaningful input. There's also huge value in independent review and oversight of the work so that it builds confidence and credibility. And we've also heard already the comments made about the need for much more regular and predictable updates. So what are some of the key aspects of the IRP that we're currently commenting on? And we're only lifting out a few of the key findings which we will use to develop some of our further comments. So the IRP, as in earlier years, develops essentially a modeled, optimized reference case. In this case, this includes the existing committed public procurement projects and also the private sector plans that are already far advanced. The reference case also includes 6 gigawatts of gas to power procurement that is essentially forced into the plan. It's assumed that that is already going to be procured. It's not modeled by the optimizer, right? The results in the text of the IRP document states that the emerging technology mix from the analysis shows that wind, solar PV, gas, and storage are the preferred options. And of course, it further says that in the initial period between 2031 and 35, mid-merit gas is not required due to the already committed 6 gigawatts of gas to power capacity that happens in the 30s, and by 2030 in this plan. What's also interesting is that no new nuclear, coal, and pump storage are built in this case. So it's interesting that the optimizer does not require these technologies for a secure and an economic least cost power system. The nuclear finding that there's no nuclear in the plan is, of course, consistent with other published modeling studies of the South African power system. Then the IRP also develops a gas at risk scenario, which essentially takes the reference case and just takes out the gas plant that was forced in, and then runs the optimizer and letting it build the power system to meet demand. And actually, it does build gas. It builds about 3.5 gigawatts of CCGT between 2031 and 2035 and ramps up that a bit faster later on in the period. The modeled scenarios using the actual optimizer in the model does not build nuclear. So the IRP modelers wanted to have a nuclear scenario, and I presume the policymakers, the government wanted that investigated. And the only way they could do that was essentially to take away the other options. That was a generation options that was available to the model to build the power system to meet demand. So essentially it constrained out particularly dispatchable gas and liquid fuel capacity between 2030 and 2050, and without really any economic justification, and forced the model in effect to build nuclear. That is how the nuclear scenario was built. So the nuclear case is not an outcome of the model's optimization, it's a forced-in scenario. So let's look a bit at some of the important flaws that unfortunately undermines the credibility of the current IRP. Firstly, the IRP document does not contain sufficient information to enable meaningful consultation. And I'm sure you'll hear about this from the other speakers as well. It's astonishing that the document does not show data on the technology capacity, energy mix, costs, or emissions for the model scenarios or the actual proposed balanced plan. Technically, of course, this means that it does not qualify as an IRP in terms of the legal definition that I mentioned to you before. And it's not clear to us how NEDLAC can participate in a meaningful consultation process if this information is simply not in the document. There were also, we see compared to previous workshops last year, there was some improvement in the technology cost assumptions overall. But unfortunately, the information remains opaque and poorly documented, and key documents like the EPRI cost and performance data report that is relied upon and was said that would be published unfortunately has not yet been published. In addition to the information that's not available, there are actually flaws in the technical modeling underpinning the IRP. The scenarios are not effectively defined to capture a reasonable breadth of plausible futures to explore key uncertainties that affect the power sector. For instance, there's no real scenarios to test changes in demand compared to what was forecast. Or critically, coal EAF. We know that coal EAF is such a key driver for outcomes in our system. There's no scenarios around that. Or gas pricing, particularly given that it's so reliant, the plan ultimately that's proposed is so reliant on gas. There's some comments in the IRP document that this will be tested after the IRP is proposed. Further, and we're looking at my time, I'm going to move a bit quicker. Some of the assumptions about nuclear technology are overly optimistic. It relies also partly on small modular nuclear reactors that are not even fully commercialized yet, etc. Also, it's a concern that the model does not make liquid fuels available for peaking plant. Liquid fuels is a very important part of the suite of options for providing peaking backup power in addition to gas. And the models that we've looked at shows that that's an important part of the equation. That's not shown. And then, of course, the analysis does not test compliance or alignment with other policies, whether it's our low net zero emissions objectives, our local air quality objectives, etc. No information is made available about how we meet those requirements. So here is the table that shows the balanced plan that's proposed in the IRP. Let's look at this, just make one or two key comments about it. The key concern here is that the proposed balanced plan is not logically derived from the underlying analysis presented in the IRP document. The conclusions and the plan is not the result of the analysis presented in the IRP document. The gas to power program is dependent on installed capacity and utilization. In other words, it depends. It really matters how much gas you burn, how much you're going to use the plant. And without that information, it's really very difficult to understand what is being proposed, what types of gas plant has to be built, whether it's peakers or combined cycle plant, and essentially leaves the plan open for abuse when it comes to the actual procurement. We recently heard the minister saying this week that he now wants to increase the capacity factors for the gas plant. Well, it'll be very useful to know what the IRP says about how much gas we actually need to burn in this plant to support the power system. Also, the model scenarios consist actually of a mix of open cycle gas turbines and CCGT capacity. However, unfortunately, these are grouped together in the plan, again, leaving very kind of unclear outcomes. Then the fact, to speak about nuclear, the fact that the IRP has defined a nuclear scenario that is actually not an economically modeled scenario doesn't mean that there is an investment case for nuclear. The nuclear scenario was created by excluding new gas and other options after 2030. So what the actual plan includes a very large nuclear build along with a very large gas build. There is simply no model scenario in the IRP that looks like this. This is logically inconsistent with the IRP's own analysis, and it will be a very expensive outcome and will displace cheaper renewable options. So this is of great concern, and is essentially, as far as we can see, a fundamental flaw in the actual analysis of the IRP. we spoke a bit about the process. We've in this diagram, we've mapped the process over the last year and raised some of our concerns. Essentially, just to give an example, for instance, in November 24, there was a very rushed stakeholder workshop with little notice. Content was only shared the day before the workshop, so there was no time to review it, etc. So you can look at these details in a bit more when you have a bit more time. So really, we have to ask, what is going on here? We have an IRP that neither went through a meaningful public consultation process nor benefited from review by independent experts. An IRP that contains lots of technical descriptions about power system modeling, but does not adequately investigate the most critical uncertainties affecting future outcomes. An IRP that presents recommendations that do not follow logically from the analysis, are not otherwise substantiated, or for which the technical and cost implications are not presented. And in effect, I think some would say, creates an illusion that the recommendations are based on sound economic principles when they are clearly not. If the IRP is not based on or tested by the modeling conducted, the question arises, why is the modeling done at all and presented as an important part of the process? Many would ask, what is going on here? What is happening? How do we make sense of this? What are the risks for South Africa? The technologies that are uneconomically forced into the plan, especially gas and nuclear, will actually rely on public procurement with limited competition, where risks and costs of these investments will be socialized. Unfortunately, as we all know, South Africa's recent empirical experience with these types of projects provides stark warnings about the enormous risk for cost overruns, opportunities for rent seeking, and even corruption. We just need to think about the experiences with Medupi, Kusile, Ngula, these mega projects, the failed 9.6 gigawatt nuclear procurement process, and the highly concerning car powership and RMIPP experience. So my last slide, Chris, the energy transition in South Africa actually presents us with one of our best opportunities to unlock sustainable economic growth and development and create many thousands, hundreds of thousands of net new jobs. The IRP can and should be the policy statement that provides this vision and galvanizes stakeholders, investors, and others to contribute to this process. This outcome is actually within reach and is certainly what the Africans deserve after load shedding, COVID, and years of economic stagnation. The sector is now currently undergoing fundamental changes with market reforms, introducing competition, and the need to accelerate economic growth and decarbonization. The time is ripe for a redesign of the IRP process to ensure that it becomes the authoritative policy vision for the sector. Rather than being an arena for endless contestation and wasted energy, the IRP can become a policy process that stakeholders can get behind and support. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that very sobering, thought-provoking presentation, Gruvia. It does raise a lot of apprehension in my mind that you have very well articulated, presented, and I think your presentation needs deep study and reflection by the policymakers and the planners in South Africa, because, as you say, it has very deep implications, and it would be turning our back on some of the huge opportunities that you have identified if we do this right. So I really value your presentation. It is cause for apprehension and reflection, and I hope that the powers that be will do just that. Thank you, Gruvia. And it's now my pleasure to introduce our second presenter, and that is Lebogang Moluwasi from the Presidential Climate Commission. And if I may ask my producer Ian to please put up the presentation for Lebogang. Lebogang is the executive manager responsible for policy and research at the Presidential Climate Commission, the PCC. She previously served on the commission as a commissioner representing Labour and as chief operations officer in the secretariat of the PCC. She was previously the head of policy at the Congress of South African Trade Unions, COSATU, responsible for labour market policy and the just transition. Lebogang was an EXCO and MANCO, that is an executive committee and management committee member at the National Economic Development and Labour Council, that is NEDLAC, the organization at which the IRP 2025 draft is currently being reviewed. And she represented organized labour in the labour market chamber of NEDLAC. She co-authored a chapter on Mistra's book on a low-carbon future for South Africa. Lebogang holds a master's degree in developmental economics from the University of Johannesburg in 2018 and is currently completing her PhD in economics. So again, a great honor to have you here, Lebogang. We've interacted before. This is your first time on one of our webinars, and we're really privileged to have you with your experience and insights, across the Labour and the Presidential Climate Commission, your activities there. So without further ado, over to you. We're looking forward to hearing your presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation. Like what was stated, this is my first sort of invitation to a session like this. I'm taken aback by the number of people that are interested in this process, and I think it's important that the integrated resource plan garners this much interest because it touches every fabric of our society. No one is unimpacted by our IRP. So the time spent getting into the crux of the discussion today is really important. And just seeing the amount of people that are here, that are experts, that have participated in the process, I think is really important. I think we can move to the next slide. So I've been asked to do something a little different from what the previous presenter has covered, who's taken us through a very in-depth presentation and overview of the IRP document. Maybe just to touch on the issue related to question a bit, having been a part of the NEDLAC processes, previously representing Labour in terms of the IRP discussions as far back as 2019, IRP 2019. What's important to note is that the NEDLAC process is then really the last opportunity for the social partners represented in NEDLAC, Labour, business, community, as well as government, to have a discussion on the updated version. So IRP, it's titled 2024. And this is, again, the last opportunity for there to be that sort of discussion before this becomes the plan, really. And then, because this is coming up as a theme around, what do we mean by meaningful consultation, right? Is putting experts and everyone into the room within like 2-day notice, or I think it was a day notice actually, into one room, meaningful consultation. One of the things the Presidential Climate Commission has raised is around the fact that we can't seem to track how the consultation resulted in an amendment to the updated version of the IRP. So there clearly is a cause for concern in terms of what do we mean when we talk about meaningful consultation. So I just wanted to touch on that in terms of procedural point of view. So I've been asked to talk about the health impacts, especially if the IRP is ignorant on not being able to constrain carbon. So I've been asked to look at what are the carbon emission impacts, as well as what are the health impacts of the IRP. And just to note that I'm going to be basing this on just the work that the PCC has done with the ESRG group, as well as the CSIR. And this work was it was undertaken to explore the potential energy and sectoral mitigation pathways through which South Africa could reach net zero CO2 emissions by mid-century. This study was developed and characterized 40 long-term greenhouse gas emissions pathways for South Africa to characterize those pathways which reach net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 or 2055. The study examined the socio-economic effects of such net zero pathways and considers the initial additional effects of key associated measures such as the carbon tax, localization of parts of the energy infrastructure supply chain, and energy efficiency measures. Energy supply systems, the transport sector, and industrial processes are known to have wide-ranging environmental impacts for air pollution, water quality, as well as water use. Measures that are taken to decarbonize these sectors are noted to have the potential to reduce these environmental impacts. 3 of the decarbonization scenarios that were also analyzed in detail to determine the potential for reducing water consumption and impacts for air quality were analyzed. The study had been undertaken using SANEDI, and it presented a set of GHG emission pathways for South Africa, some reaching net zero CO2 emissions by 2050 and others by 2055. And in the other panels, without a net zero CO2 or GHG emission constraints. The pathways were characterized by the cumulative GHG emissions from 2021 to 2050 and have been modeled with and without a range of key long-term measures, and in 2 worlds, one with strong multilateral regimes and other with a weak regime. Pathways were explored in detail and at sectoral levels and evaluated economically. If we could go to the next slide, please. So what the next slide then shows us is that having analyzed these 3 different pathways, or where you have a net zero by 2050, a net zero by 2055, and then where there is no net zero and there's no limit. And when you look at what happens in terms of sectors, it's not surprising to see that a lot of the decarbonization work, in order for us to reach net zero by 2050 across all 3 scenarios, needs to take place within the electricity sector. So hence the direct sort of linkage between the study that the PCC did in terms of the considerations for the IRP. So a lot needs to take place in terms of decarbonization within the electricity sector. When you take into consideration pathways for 2050, of course, it'll look different from 2055. And then, of course, when there's also no limits. If we could go to the next slide, please. What the study then does is to look at what does this all mean in terms of co-benefits of national GHG emission pathways to net zero CO2 for South Africa. So needless to say, it's obvious that, you know, there'll definitely be reductions in ambient pollutant concentrations from both a 9 gigaton or an 8 gigaton pathway up to 2050. And these are, there are, however, some localized increases here and there, but what is the main takeaway there is that there are large differences between what was the reference case, which was the unconstrained case, as compared to the two scenarios that were investigated for the year 2023, but less for 2032 and 2050. Important to note that there are huge health benefits for us seeing a reduction in ambient pollutants for both a 9 gigaton as well as an 8 gigaton pathway, which is it's what you would expect. And then when you translate sort of these reductions into actual monetary terms, you then see that for a sort of 9 gigaton pathway, there you will find that when it comes to early mortality as a result when it comes to early mortality and having averted that and premature mortality across all ages brought about by emissions reduction, you see a 30 billion savings for low scenarios of 9 gigaton, as well as a 33 billion savings from an 8 gigaton from a high scenario. So it's definitely in our best interest as a country to reduce the number of pollutants, because in terms of total costs, when you look at an 8 gigaton, there's huge amounts of potentials there in terms of your impact on your health sector, especially when you look at the impacts of premature mortality across all ages brought about by emissions reductions. If we can go to this next slide, please. So maybe just to draw like clear comparisons to the IRP process, having been able to be part of the NEDLAC process and given the opportunity to also review the updated IRP, one of the things that we noted, especially when reviewing the sections on legislative frameworks and what legislative frameworks informed the IRP, I think a glaring omission was the focus or making reference to the Air Quality Act of 2004, and also not having a clear understanding in terms of whether the IRP is compliant with the minimums emission standard, given the fact that this has been a topical conversation of late, given the fact that the Minister of DFFE has been issuing compliances, particularly to Eskom and SASOL. So it would be good if it's spelled out properly in the IRP to indicate whether this current IRP is indeed MES compliant. And if it is MES compliant, given the balanced plan as indicated on page 30 of the updated IRP, then there needs to be an explanation in terms of what is making us MES compliant. Is it because we are retrofitting coal-fired power station, then if that's the case, what is the cost of that type of retrofitting? And if that cost is taken into consideration when costing the actual IRP. And if cheaper technologies are available, why are we not making the case to invest money into those cheaper, or the development of those cheaper technologies? So the conversation around MES compliance is actually very important, considering the fact that studies have shown that, you know, doing the work in terms of air quality does have an immediate monetary benefit for South Africa, but not just monetary, just a decent standard of living and standard of life for the people that are living in those areas. The Climate Change Act, I know it says bill here, but the Climate Change Act to some degree is mentioned within the updated IRP, because the SETS processes are still underway, and the DFFE is still currently in the process of discussions with the various departments. It would also be interesting to find out what sets would then be allocated, and how do we become compliant? How is the IRP compliant with that process moving forward? I want to touch on the issues related to the Paris Agreement, as well as the NDC, and why it's important for the IRP to align with emissions reduction goals, because the conversation sometimes gets a bit lost in translation, where there's a sense that being compliant with the Paris Agreement or submitting an NDC is a nice to have. It's actually not. These are the tools and the instruments that will ensure that you are designing your electricity plans in such a way that, for the case of the country, it remains competitive. So if we make reference to the slide that I showed with regards to the need for there to be decarbonization within the electricity system, this is in our best interest, especially when we take into consideration the impact of the carbon border adjustment mechanism that should be a thing in the next couple of years, which will then start to really inform our competitiveness really as a country, and our ability to export our products, and determine the balance of payments for the country. Also, what's important to ensure that the IRP is aligned to your nationally determined contributions is also this fact that it's now sending a signal to the market that South Africa is serious about its decarbonization trajectory to net zero by 2050. And what then that starts to trigger in the market is financial flows, especially when you look at climate finance coming into the country, which helps us with our mitigation goals as well as adaptation and resilience. So just making the point there that the IRP must consider environmental limits and transition planning. This is not just a nice to have. This is really the yardstick for competitiveness for the future. I just wanted to touch on one more slide, chairperson of the session. And this is around looking at the trajectory that we need to follow, taking us to net zero. It's also linked to the slide that I flighted earlier around the need for decarbonization within electricity. But what this slide helps us see is just how much of decarbonization is needed, and that it needs to be done between 2030 and 2024, which will have implications for the 2035 NDC. So bulk of the work that is required and that needs to happen needs to take place between 2030 as well as 24. So that's why this particular IRP document is so important, especially when you take the need for us to decarbonize into consideration, right? And just to make this point as well, that, you know, if we don't decarbonize as much, if we don't decarbonize with the rate that is required to meet our NDC, then when you're looking at the next successive 5-year periods, it means that you need to decarbonize at a faster rate, which then gives you very little planning room. And then secondly, then your decarbonization trajectory becomes really expensive. And then lastly, it becomes incredibly unjust for those communities, as well as those companies that will have to decarbonize within a short space of time. When we space it out properly and we look at the full picture up to 2015, it offers us the opportunity to plan properly and gives us proper planning horizons. And why we need the IRP to be compliant with South Africa's NDC is so that this planning process can happen a bit more seamlessly instead of haphazardly, and so that it also doesn't pit our energy security needs with our decarbonization trajectory. So I'll leave it there, Chairperson. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lebogang, for your presentation. You've covered the impacts on health and CO2 emission reductions, the impact on water use and water quality and air quality of the current IRP. It does worry me that it is not clear, as to whether or not we align with our nationally determined contribution 2030, and whether it aligns with the pathway which you've put on screen, in decarbonization to 2050, and the fact that if we don't start now, it makes things more expensive and more unjust if we have to do this transition in a much shorter period of time. I think you've touched on some really key issues that we need to think about. And I'm going to be studying your presentation in much more detail because it requires that to understand what level of alignment is there with the current IRP, with what is needed in terms of decarbonization. And you've also highlighted some of the cost implications, just for example, the health cost implications, which show massive savings if we can decarbonize and reduce emissions, pollution to the levels that we are planning for and that we need. So it is an economic imperative. It's not just a nice to have, as you put it. So thanks very much for your presentation. Look, ladies and gentlemen, we were going to have a 10-minute comfort break at this point, but in the interest of time, because we are significantly over time, I'm going to proceed on immediately, and we're going to dispense with the comfort break. I'm sorry to do this to you. You might have to nip off to the bathroom and then be back again, but I think in the interest of time, we do need to press ahead. So with that, I'm going to call on our next presenter and introduce her. She is Monique Leroux from the Center for Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies at the University of Stellenbosch. Monique started at Eskom, where she was a senior engineer in network planning, responsible for planning and grid connection of new renewable energy plants to the Eskom network. Thereafter, she worked in the private sector for several years, overseeing grid planning of over 1 gigawatt, 1,000 megawatts of new generation plant, before joining the CSIR in 2020. Her research at the CSIR was focused on national grid planning and grid stability, with the introduction of large-scale renewable energy to the national network. Monique has a Bachelor of Engineering degree in Electrical and Electronic Engineering from Stellenbosch University. She has an MSc in Electrical Engineering from UCT, University of Cape Town, and is a registered professional engineer. She joined the CRSES in 2023 as Chief Engineer and is currently working towards completing her PhD. Now, I am told that Monique is a specialist in the transmission grid, and you can see that from the bio that I've just read out. And this brings an important consideration that is needed in the IRP in terms of spatial planning and the constraints in the transmission grid to the plans that one may have for new generation capacity. We already know that there are nodes in the grid which are experiencing significant constraints, and this is really shaping in some way what we can implement in the form of new generation. So I'm hoping we're going to hear a lot more about these spatial aspects from Monique. Monique, you have a free hand, of course, and we're looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Over to you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Good afternoon, everyone. As Chris has said, I'm Monique Leroux. I'm from the Center of Renewable and Sustainable Energy Studies at Stellenbosch, as you can see from the lovely picture there of Stellenbosch University. And I'm going to talk about today a topic which I often find myself talking about these days, and I hope I'm not repeating too much of what's already been said publicly about this, but it's going to rather open the floor for some debate or fresh debate on this issue and how this translates into the IRP and into the energy pathways for South Africa. So the title of my presentation is Renewable Energy and Transmission Expansion Considerations for the IRP. Okay, just a quick overview of my presentation. Firstly, just looking at the integrated resource plan and more specifically integrated resource planning. I'm not going to touch too much on this because other presenters have already gone into this in detail. Then look at Plexos as a tool which we use to do our energy modeling, and then integrated resource planning, co-optimized with grid planning, what that means. And then how we should and could do costing for renewable energy, then the impact of renewable energy on grid-related costs, and then lastly, I'm just going to quickly run over some projects that we're busy within this space. Okay, so integrated resource planning, Javier gave us a really good analysis of what that is, and I don't want to bore you with some more details around that. I think the only thing that I want to say about this is the IRP, which is important to understand for the context of the rest of my presentation, is the IRP consists, generally the energy model that's developed to run the IRP or to get outputs for the IRP consists of a long-term model, which is generally your capacity or your generation expansion plan. In South Africa, we have a generation expansion plan because that part of the model only looks at your generation expansions and it optimizes across the entire modeling horizon. So typically that would be up to 2050. And the extended modeling horizon necessitates larger time snaps. So if you're looking at a long horizon like that, up to 2050, we won't consider every hour of every day for the entire period because that would make it computationally too difficult. If we run a study like this and we look at the long time horizon, it could take us anything from 1 day to a few days to run one study. So every time you change something in your model, you've got new parameters or new assumptions or new input data, you need to run your model again, and that means you're waiting for a couple of days for it to solve. So you want to try and solve on computational power as much as possible. That is why we do a long-term model over that horizon, and then we look at a shorter-term model, which is your unit commitment model or your economic dispatch model. And this will take snapshots in time where you look at each hour of the day, and then the model determines how your generation is going to be dispatched and decide how that can be done in the most economic way over that time period. Okay, so then Plexos as a tool. Plexos is the gold standard that's used throughout the world by electricity utilities, also used by us to do our planning. It's a commercial software. Unfortunately, it's not free of charge or open source. It unfortunately has a quite hefty price tag, which often is a bit of a deterrent to allow people to use it more widely. And Plexos doesn't only model for electricity. You can model the full sector, energy sector in there, including gas and water. Plexos is an energy market simulation engine. So it's a techno-economic engine. It's not per se an engineering design program like Silent, which we use for our grid analysis. And Plexos is used for modeling your production and to optimize so that you can get your best investment decisions. Okay, this is just an example of the modeling framework and the software, how that works in Plexos software. So on the one hand, you've got your inputs. So in Plexos, you want to link your demand with your supply. And that's a whole basis of how it solves and how it would work. So you've got your input data, which would consist of your demand forecast, your existing supply, generation supply that you currently have on your network and all the parameters relating to that. And then you give Plexos all your new supply options. So that's new generation technologies that might become available in the future or that is available to the system to build, and the cost assumptions related to that, also the technical characteristics, and then also things like your carbon tax, and then you also add your constraints, for example, limitations on your renewable energy builds per year, security of supply, constraints that you might have on your network, and that all goes into Plexos, which does the techno-economic least cost optimization, and then you get your output, which is basically, you can see that what would typically be the outputs that you get from Plexos, but the key questions that are answered is what needs to get built in terms of the new generation, the megawatts that need to come online on the system going into the future. When does that need to be built, the timing, and when does old generation need to be or could be decommissioned? Okay, I'm just going to move this a little bit. So this is our motto at the office. We like to remind ourselves about when the days get long and when things get difficult. And it says prediction is very difficult, especially if it's about the future. And it basically just points to, and obviously it's tongue in cheek, but it points to the fact that this is based on a lot of assumed inputs and inputs that might change in future. So we say that our Plexos model or the IRP model is not a master. It's made to inform decisions and inform decision makers, and it does not dictate. So what we look at from our outputs in Plexos is what are the common themes and trends from our outcome, how is risk been considered, and what is suitable pathways or pathways for South Africa given that. And then some of the factors that have not been directly considered by Plexos, which is still important in the context of the IRP, is the security of supply that you would get by diversifying energy mix, for example, promoting localization and industrialization, and technology transfer, skills development, job creation, which are all very pertinent issues in South Africa. Then the reduction of emissions and the usage of scarce resources, such as water in South Africa. And then items 1 and 3 can be well defined or quantified in Plexos, even though it isn't done specifically for the IRP or in our energy models at the moment. Item 2, unfortunately, can't be quantified or modeled in Plexos. Okay, and then the last point, which leads us into the next part of the presentation, is what deep technical studies are needed. Transmission and modeling in Plexos is very simplified. For the current IRP and the past iterations of the IRP, grid was not considered at all. And Plexos did identify this as an issue, and going forward, they have included a simplified grid in Plexos so that you can have multi-node models, and I'll explain that a little bit further, but this is really the crux of what we need if we talk about bringing grid into our model. I'm having trouble with my presentation again. Okay. The integrated resource planning co-optimized with grid planning. Okay, so I think we've all heard, which is a topic that is often discussed these days, is how power grids are changing. So the transmission grids were traditionally designed to distribute power in one direction only from base load power stations to the urban centers, and then from there to suburban centers, and then to rural areas. And your transmission lines would step down, and your substations as well, as your load decreases from those areas, and the power intensity decreases as well. And now this is a nice slide that one of the engineers in our center made, which just shows the power flows, which we had traditionally. We had the power flow coming down from the top to the bottom, and now you've got distribution that is, not distribution, generation that is distributed throughout the country, and you've got power that's flowing back all over the network. And obviously the network wasn't designed initially to support that sort of integration and absorbance of generation in the rural areas, in areas where there isn't transmission development. And now that means we need to think about how the grid should be re-engineered. Okay. Previously, the IRP was done through a linear planning process. As I've said before, there was a single node model, which we also call a copper plate model. So that means here that your load in your energy model, it is assumed that your load is directly connected to your generation. So for that model, grid would not be considered. It would be assumed that what you generate can be directly supplied to your customers, and grid is not considered, it's not costed for. And then you would do that model first, which is your capacity expansion plan and your economic dispatch model, as I explained earlier, your long-term model and your short-term model. And that typically is what goes into your IRP. And then from your IRP, you have got the TDP in South Africa, the Transmission Development Plan, which is your grid development plan, that takes the outputs of the IRP that says this is the amount of generation that needs to get built at this time. It incorporates that into a transmission development plan, and only after that the grid dynamics get quantified and it gets implemented from there. And traditionally this model was fine because you had large generation builds that had very long lead times, and that was on the critical path, and grid generally had shorter lead times compared to big generation builds, so it was fine to do it that way. But now with the introduction of renewable energy, obviously things are getting turned on its head a little bit, and this is the sort of the proposed model of how to do modeling in future, considering grid dynamics into it. So you would have a multi-node model where you don't assume that your generation is next to your demand. You would co-optimize, or you would spatially disaggregate it, and you would have grid in between. Plexos brings in a little bit of grid into that is quite simple. So you would have that in your energy model, but on the side you would have a transmission grid model, which is shown here. And you would go through your first iteration of doing your capacity expansion model, and together with your production cost model, that would give you an output to say that renewable energy or whichever new generation needs to get built in this location, and this is how much needs to get built at whatever time. You would take that back into your grid model to see what the grid constraints is of building that amount of generation in a specific location. You would see what the cost would be and time in terms of grid development, what the constraints would be, and take that back into your Plexos capacity expansion model, do your next run considering those constraints and costs, get output that is least cost optimized out of that, take it back into your grid. So you've got your iterations between your capacity expansion model, your production cost model, and your grid model, so that the two can be co-optimized with each other, and the results from the one can feed into the other one. And then on the side, you've also got your geospatial resource model, which looks at land availability, also resource availability within that land, and what probable generation capacity factors would be for those. Okay, so why is this process important, and what is going to happen if we don't do this? So previously and historically, to price generation, the levelized cost of electricity was used And I'll go a little bit into the detail of that in the next slide. But we did an analysis of the cost projection of solar PV, wind, CSP that was done by Arena, Fraunhofer and Lazards. And as you can see, stunning decrease in cost for all those technologies. There's only really bioenergy that didn't show a massive cost decrease over time for the last decade. And then from this, it's easy to make the general consensus that the cost of renewable energy, specifically wind and solar, has fallen over the last decade. And it makes sense to have a large rollout of renewable energy because it makes sense environmentally and also economically because the costs are so low. But then if you look at what constitutes the LCOE, the levelized cost of energy, let me just move this back. Then it looks at your upfront capital, your capex, your fixed and variable O&M costs, and your taxes, which is your total cost for your project divided by the lifetime energy cost of your plant. So for renewable energy plants, if you look at your plant in isolation, you just look at your renewable energy plant, this sort of is the analogy of someone going down a hill with a bicycle. It's easy money, it makes sense, it's cheap. But then when you start bringing in aspects like location dependent generation profiles, if you bring in grid access and grid infrastructure that needs to be developed, you're starting to hit like a road that's a little bit more straight and you don't have gravity working for you anymore. And then when you start considering grid instability and costing for that, you're going a little bit more uphill, and you find that it's a bit harder work to get your projects incorporated into a system at a very low cost. Okay, we did a literature review of how VRE, LCOE, so LCOE for renewable energy is calculated in literature. We couldn't find, there were some studies that looked at various aspects of VRE and how that can be incorporated into LCOE to make it more cost reflective. There was only one study which is referenced here, which looked at all or most of the components that's needed for a VRE, LCOE. And most of it comes down to your location of your VRE and how that would have a material and marked increase, or I forgot the word, but how that would influence your LCOE. So, for instance, a project that is located in Port Elizabeth, just outside of Kucha Harbour, would obviously have very short transport costs or very low transport costs because it's very easy to get to site. A project that's located in the Karoo on top of a mountain or on top of the escarpment with very low access road or no access road, where all that have to be transported and built, those costs would increase. Your capacity factor would be different over different locations, your O&M costs, your operation costs, all of that is very location dependent. And then specifically for grid also, do you have access immediately to a big transmission substation that you can just build a quick short line to get connected, or would you need to build a massive new transmission line and transmission substation, which will increase your costs excessively? So technical inputs into Plexos. So the LCOE doesn't go directly into Plexos, but all the components that make up the LCOE go into Plexos, so that you still sort of get a LCOE calculation at the end of the day within Plexos. So your capex, your fixed and variable operating cost, your fuel charge, which for the renewables obviously is zero, that will all go into Plexos. And if you've got a single node model, all of that will be assumed to be uniform for VRE. One value for that is considered for everyone, for all the plants in South Africa. All the ratings, all your generation profiles are assumed as one, which obviously is problematic in itself. And then together with that, no grid costs are considered. So if you look at that, those factors, it means that VRE it might be more prevalent in your final build because the costs for those are low and grid is not considered, location is not considered, and those factors are not brought into play. Okay, so using the traditional LCOE could overestimate VRE in your model, although various alternative LCOE calculation methods were proposed. There's overall lack of standard methodology. And then just quickly, I'm just starting to run through it quickly because I realize my time is running out, is that there was a study that was done by EMBA, which is an international think tank on renewable energy and the clean energy transition. They did an analysis of 35 European countries to look at how their grids are geared towards the clean energy transition. And they found that most of those 35 countries did not have sufficient grid to reach the climate mitigation targets set for 2030, and that most of them would need a substantial cost investment into their grid, and that these costs are a substantial part of the total energy transition. Okay, so just in summary, the impact of not considering grid in your expansion plan, as I mentioned, not accounting for grid-related constraints in cost can artificially skew your model in favor of renewable energy. Impact on the least cost expansion pathways, which could have an impact on your tariff. So your tariff might be higher in the end than what your model predicts because transmission wasn't included in that. It could lead to higher system costs and underutilized assets if planning is done at a later stage. It could cause connection delays, transmission builds, usually has longer lead times than the renewable energy plant. It could lead to high levels of curtailment, which we're seeing it's becoming a massive issue in countries like Germany and the rest of Europe. It creates market uncertainty if developers can't be assured of grid access, and then also high levels of renewable energy can lead to grid instability, which need to be planned for to avoid future problems. And then what is being done internationally, just quickly running through this, we looked at some countries, how they are doing and approaching their planning processes. We looked at Germany, United Kingdom, Australia, which each represents sort of their own unique problems in this whole planning process. Australia was the only country internationally that we could find that is doing a proper iterative planning process where they are incorporating grid back into the capacity expansion plan. All of them have got very large and ambitious renewable energy targets that need to be met by around 2030. With the amount of gigawatts of renewable energy that they want to connect to their grid, and then just the total investment that is shown, which they determine from their model would be needed to invest it into their grid to make their grid ready for renewable energy. And then interestingly, just on the dynamic modeling side, most of these models didn't properly, or not in the model specifically, but even in the planning, didn't do proper dynamic analysis. And if they did dynamic analysis, looking at the stability issues of the grid, it was usually only done either a year ahead or for 10 years ahead. None of them did dynamic modeling analysis for the whole modeling horizon up to 2050, which means that going into future years where you've got very high levels of renewable energy, there are still unknown problems. And Australia acknowledges that in their plan specifically. Okay, just also the European network operator also made some determinations about how much would need to be invested in grid. That's just grid between the European countries to facilitate cross-border renewable energy flows. You can see that is 220 billion euros for the first 10 years, and for the next 10 years, they estimate they'll need about 700 billion euros. And this did not account for internal network upgrades within the countries. Okay, I'm gonna just quickly, this was also analysis that we did of the wholesale electricity price in selected countries over the past decade to just show that as renewable energy has increased, it has brought price increases and also price volatility, more specifically, not only for the wholesale electricity price, but also for the residential electricity price. And then this was an interesting model that we found in the literature, which was the only model that we could find. And the authors also acknowledged that this is the only model that has been done so far that has been published, where they did hourly dispatches for generation within the Spanish grid. And to show what would that look like if you incorporate flexibility and stability requirements into your grid. So if you considered your flexibility and stability requirements, it showed that you would need high levels of combined cycle gas generation to be installed to meet your flexibility and stability as your VRE increases. It also showed that without additional storage, the VRE would need to be significantly curtailed to meet the flexibility and stability requirements, and that your capacity factor for solar could be as low as 8% in 2040 due to those factors. It also showed that for these low capacity factors, you've got an increase in LCOE, which leads to an increase in electricity prices. It also showed that for 55% of VRE installed capacity and 39% in annual generation, the system experiences no drop in emissions compared to 2017 levels, with a steep rise in the weighted average system LCOE. So they did acknowledge that they only considered available current generation technologies, and that things might change if you look at something like hydrogen or power to gas or increased BESS connection to your network. Okay, just quickly, the projects that we're busy doing with in this space. One of the projects is that we're doing with our partners at Presidential Climate Commission and the Danish Energy Agency is to look at what grid would cost in South Africa if we want to have certain penetration levels of renewable energy. So for that, we have done a geospatial model which look at how renewable energy fares in terms of land use and profile in South Africa, how that changes over the different provinces and what you can expect for different locations. And then that is fed into our capacity expansion model, the flexibility production cost model. And then we've got that same iterative process that I spoke about earlier, where our energy model through our capacity expansion and our flexibility model is fed back into our grid model, looking at steady state and dynamic power system simulation, and then fed back into via iterative loop into your energy model. And then these are two other models that might just be of interest, is the market model for CRSCS that we're doing for the market, and then another one for system inertia, where we're trying to cost system inertia in the system. And then that's all for me. Thank you very much. Back to you, Chris.
Thank you, Monique, for those insights. And yes, a lot of questions in my mind arising from your presentation, which I hope we'll be able to cover during the Q&A if we have enough time. But thanks again for joining us, for giving those insights with your expert knowledge on both modeling from your work at the CSIR and at Eskom, and understanding the spatial aspects of the transmission grid. I'm now going to move on to our last presenter for the day before we do the wrap up, and that is Clyde Mallinson. Clyde is an independent energy analyst. He uses his broad experience in the resource sectors to undertake techno-economic modeling energy systems, providing solutions at different scales. He uses his knowledge to fund management to craft innovative ownership and funding models for large-scale deployment of renewable energy infrastructure. And he's particularly interested in renewable energy infrastructure. He's particularly interested in developing district-level citizen-owned funding models for the bulk supply of electricity to local municipalities. Obviously, a key area in view of the state of our municipalities. Clyde has presented at many NERSA and Eskom tariff hearings over the past decade, and all the public hearings that have been held for the IRP for electricity he's been involved in. He's a regular commentator on energy matters on radio and TV, and has been interviewed by numerous print media houses, both locally and abroad. Clyde, over to you. You are the last presenter for the day, and it's useful for you to be able to really have heard what others have to say in giving your presentation. Over to you.
Thanks, Chris. Off we go. I'm going to be sticking my neck out a bit and putting some numbers on the table, because I think what we've seen so far is very devoid of actual numbers. So I want to start off on the presentation with looking at the so-called energy trilemma, where it's often attested to that you can't have a reliable system which is also affordable, which is also green. And I'll just use green in the sense of sustainable, low carbon. Now, that may have been the case in the past, but at the moment we can actually dissolve that triangle and end up with a trifecta, which is a 3-horse race, or not a 3-horse race. It's where you predict the first, second, and third winners. So in the situation we find ourselves in today, in the energy transition, going from what was used, where we used fossil fuels and coal, into a renewable energy transition, we actually don't have those 3 things competing against each other. We have them all running in the same direction, and in fact, all making up the trifecta of the race. So I'm going to show a series of slides now, which basically look at our situation, and I'm using 2040 quite interestingly as my base point. So we're going to move to 2040 quite soon. And I noted that I think the speaker, I think Lebogang, said 2040, we need to have done most of our decarbonization of the energy system by 2040. And someone else also mentioned 2040 as a useful date, and I've liked to pin 2040 where we're going to look at. But just starting off with 2025, all of my slides are going to be of this particular graphic with different years and different combinations. Just a couple of things to point out that are worth noting. One of them is that I want you just to keep an eye on this little block here, which shows load shedding. And that potential load shedding, if it goes above 3% in terms of time, it turns red instead of white. Up to 3% we can handle quite easily with demand side management. So I don't show any demand side management in my model, but I'm not allowed to go above 3 on that load shedding marker. So this is where we sit at the moment. You can see a pie chart of the splits. We 80% coal, I think. This little bit below the line here is power going into storage, and the green is power coming out of storage. And our annual energy cost at the moment, just for energy, not for transmission and delivery and admin fees and everything, is about 300 billion, the cost of production. If I suddenly jump to 2040, and just a quick disclaimer here, or not a disclaimer, I'm one of those people who can't afford Plexus, so I just built my own model to be able to do this, because as I think Monique said, Plexus is rather expensive. So when I put in the 2040 load profile, which in the IRP is 50% higher than the current load profile or demand profile, my model tries vainly to meet that, and obviously it can't, but it just switches on all the existing OCGT and runs them flat out. And you'll notice my little load shedding box here is at 99%, and I'm short of 76 terawatt hours. And so obviously that's just me showing that 2040 load profile. And we've got to see, how do we get from where we are at the moment to meet that 2040 load profile? I do want to just mention that the load profile that they've used in the IRP is completely wrong. I'm not worried about the energy usage in a year. I just contest that the shape of the load profile by 2040 will be very, very different to just a linear extrapolation of the current shape. And in fact, our load profile will be highest at midday, because we'll be filling our battery storage from surplus solar at that time. And the batteries, when they're filling, form part of the demand. So let's look at our first look now at the IRP 2040. And remember, I've pegged that date. That's what the IRP says we should have. You can see the nuclear at the bottom, then coal, then the CCGT that's put in. Then we've still got some hydro, mainly from Cahora Bassa. We've got solar and wind, and we've got a little bit of storage coming into play, a tiny bit of storage. So you'll see the storage on the pie chart here is underutilized, and we've got a whole lot of excess. We're going to be producing 113 terawatt hours of excess, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but we're going to have that excess. And you can see all this pesky wind and solar somehow is going to have to be curtailed. Or we can plot it the other way around and say, well, the system operator is rationally going to fill up the demand curve with the lowest cost stuff first. So the solar and the wind are going to come in, And then all this pesky nuclear and coal and CCGT is going to have to be curtailed. But there's a problem. You can't curtail that, because if you're going to run CCGT at a 50% capacity factor, which I'm showing here, there it is, 50% capacity factor, you have to run at a certain amount. And if you ran it less in the day perhaps and more at night, then you'd have to curtail the coal, because you're already producing too much at night. And if you try to run the nuclear to be load following, the cost of the nuclear would virtually double if its capacity factor halved. So it's not that easy. And what's happened, and I think Javier pointed this out, that when they discussed some of the modeling, they said, you know what, in order to put nuclear in, we're going to take CCGT out. And then they said, okay, to put CCGT in, we're going to take nuclear out. But they ended up with both in, which is why we've got that 113 terawatt hours of surplus. And in today's money terms, to produce via the IRP 2025 in 2040 would cost us about 609 billion rand just for the energy production. So then I thought to myself, what happens if we just get rid of nuclear? So we just take out the nuclear. And all that happens is we save 100 billion rand a year, in fact, 102 billion, and we start using our storage, because now we've got room to use the storage. When we had the nuclear, we didn't use the storage because the storage was filled on day one, and then we had a surplus every other day, and we couldn't store that surplus because the storage was full. So the difference between putting nuclear in and not putting nuclear in is 102 billion rand per year, not as a capital cost. This is an annual operating cost. So then I thought, let's put the nuclear back in again and let's take out the CCGT. And I've seen there's been quite a lot of questions in the analysis of why is the CCGT running at a 50%, why is it even there? So I thought, well, let's take it out. And you can see we're still in the safe zone here. It hasn't gone red. We're using our storage more. And in this case, we save about 90 billion a year. So the CCGT coming in basically just pushes up the cost per year by about 90 billion. So then I had a look and said, okay, what about if we take away the coal, get rid of all of the coal? And you'll see if we get rid of all the coal without doing other things, we've got a problem here. We've got 11% of the time load shedding. You can see the gaps here where we're not meeting the demand. This, by the way, is an average annual hourly output, which is, it's better obviously to look at it month by month, but in terms of time here, I've done it as an annual one, and the picture's relatively simple to understand. So we can't just get rid of coal without doing more things. But even when we do get rid of coal, you can see we're using our storage more usefully now. So this excess over here is going into storage, and then it's coming out of storage at night. So then I thought, let's try something else. What about if we just put less wind and solar in? So now we've got less excess. You can see only 19 terawatt hours instead of 113. And I'm not saying that surplus is a bad thing. I'm just pointing it out. If we put less wind and solar, we've got less excess, but we're still spending 565 billion rand a year to produce that energy. So then I thought, wait a bit, let's get rid of coal and nuclear and CCGT. And clearly we can't do that because we've got a 48% of the time we're going to have load shedding. And I thought, well, wait a bit, why don't we top this up with gas now? Let's put in flexible open cycle gas, and we're aiming now to put in just enough gas to reach our demand profile. So let's have a crack at that and see what happens. You see, I'm filling up that gap with gas, and I've gone from 327 where I can't actually count that because I've got shortfall. But when I fill it up with gas, it's 519 billion. And you can see there's very little surplus now. And this is old school thinking. It says that the demand calls the shots, and we've got to make generation to meet the demand. And what people don't really seem to get is that in this transition we're going through, it's the generation or the new generation that calls the shots, not the old generation. The new generation calls the shots, and we have to adapt our demand to the generation profile. So the next one I'm going to show you is if instead of putting that gas in, if we just increased the wind and solar and storage. And I want to tell you what kind of increase we've got. From this model, I've got 9 gigs of storage. On this one, I've got 45 gigawatts of storage. So I've increased my storage 5-fold. Relative to the IRP, I've more or less doubled the solar, and I've increased the wind by 50%. So solar double, wind up by 50%, storage up 5-fold. And you can see now that we've got this surplus. A lot of it's going into storage in the day, which means if I added that on top of the load profile, you can see why the load profile would be highest in the daytime, because I'm charging my storage. And then at night, I discharge from my storage, and I end up with a nice proportional, about a 50-50 split in energy between wind and solar, and my storage is actually working now. It's not superfluous. But the key thing here is that the cost is 351 billion instead of 609 billion. And I'm costing it in as if I couldn't do anything with that surplus. I'm having to discard that surplus, but include the cost of discarding that surplus or curtailing that surplus into this calculation, which I've done in every case. So there it is. That's the IRP 2040, 609 billion. This is an alternate IRP 2040, 351 billion. That's not testing the energy trilemma in terms of that triangle. It's actually saying that we can save 258 billion rand per year. Yes, per year. There's plenty of money available there to add in the synchronous condenser and other gadgets that may be required to give us inertia and the elements that Monique spoke about. There's more than enough money to extend and upgrade the transmission as well as the distribution grid. There's 258 billion per year. Goodness, that's kind of the numbers that people talk about as collectively being required to upgrade our grid. And up to 60% of this would actually be what we call behind the meter. Every single town, metro, and city in South Africa can do up to 60% of its needs behind the meter with solar and storage. And so that solar that I'm showing in this model is a combination of utility as well as rooftop solar, and it's close to where the demand is, so it places no extraneous loads on the transmission grid. In fact, I'm not even convinced that we do need to do that much upgrading of the transmission grid. I'm not saying there isn't upgrading, but it's nowhere near what it's made out to be or required. So I've plotted this now as the IRP 2025, as per shown by the IRP document that's currently up for discussion. My estimate up to 2040 is about 195 billion that would need to be spent, and that excludes grid expansion that needs to go with this. And believe me, this model is going to need plenty of grid expansion as well if you're looking to put in 7 or 8 gigs of nuclear near the coast or wherever it is, and you've got to have transmission lines running up to Gauteng. That's the model. This is what the recommended IRP would look like. Total capital spend of 135 billion. But remember, this will cost very little to run. Hence the 250 billion rand per year saving of this model versus this model. So don't confuse. Not only is the saving massive, but the capital expenditure is about $60 billion a year over this period, less than for the existing one. And I haven't even started touching on the savings this would make in terms of health. But what is interesting is that you'll see by 2037 or so, there's no coal left, which locks in perfectly with Lebohong's model that says we need to decarbonize our electricity system sharply. And in fact, it needs to be decarbonized by 2040 if we're going to have a shot of getting to net zero by 2050. So that's it. It's a new dawn. There's no energy trilemma. There's a trifecta. We can win on all three counts. And why aren't we doing this? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Clyde, for that very challenging presentation, challenging the thinking of the current IRP in a radical way, in a way which your analysis shows could actually result in massive savings and avoid this competition between the three pillars and turn it into a race where there are going to be three winners, a first, second, and a third winner. Very interesting, very challenging, very thought-provoking. And I hope it does do some soul searching because according to your analysis, we can meet our national determined contributions to carbon emission reduction, not only nationwide, but in the energy sector, and at the same time produce massive savings. Yes, you have noted that there will be increased costs, for example, on the grid and inertia and these sort of things, but these are things that can be solved, according to you, with a bit of money, and there's plenty of money to do just that, if you look at the savings that you've identified per year. So again, I think this is deserving of some serious thought before simply proceeding with the status quo as things stand. Well, ladies and gentlemen, with that, we've come to the end of the formal presentations, and I'm going to call on Professor Winkler Harold Winkler to give us his insights on these four presentations, and of course on the thoughts presented by Subesh Pillay at the beginning, giving some overall view of what is facing South Africa's energy policy and planning. So Harold is a professor at PRISM in the School of Economics at the University of Cape Town. His research includes just energy transitions and equity and adaptation, as well as equitable transitions away from fossil fuels and low emission development strategies, together with nationally determined contributions. Harold is rated by the NRF, National Research Foundation, as an A1 scholar, that is a leading scholar in his or her field internationally, for his research on the development, climate, social justice, and economic aspects of this subject. He's a member of the South African delegation to the negotiations under the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and he recently served as a joint editor-in-chief of the international journal Climate Policy on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as well as two co-facilitators of the technical dialogue of the global stocktake under the Paris Agreement. So a person who is deeply knowledgeable about climate change internationally, and carbon emission targets, and nationally determined contributions. He's been involved in all of these things at a very deep level. Harold, please, can you give us your thoughts on these presentations and your own personal insights on the subject at hand? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Thanks for the opportunity. And yeah, I was really struck by what the acting DG of Electricity and Energy had to say. I understand he had leave us now, but really hearing that it's going beyond crisis management, and I hope that the department will bring a long-term perspective to the IRP. I'm not going to walk through each of the presentations. You've heard them, but I will present some thoughts and certainly relate to just some of the things that struck me as on 4 really excellent presentations, but also want to, in this wrapping up, return a little bit, take a little bit more of a step back, and much as Grover Steyn laid out very clearly that a good IRP must deliver in terms of outcome and process, and I think that's as you're about to open the discussion, is useful to ask us, what should a good IRP actually do? Well, at a very high level, I imagine that while there are still more than 500 people there, perhaps there's common cause that we should achieve energy for sustainable development very, very broadly. Clyde just spoke to trilemmas and trifectas. But we're coming out of at this stage, out of discussions we've been having in the last years, where it's all been about avoiding load shedding. Everybody's been obsessed about that. Don't want that to kind of keeping energy availability factors from going even lower than they currently are. But really, I think it's important in this respect, and came up a couple of times, including from the DEG, that there's a lot of framing around this in terms of energy security, and I thought it might be helpful to remind us in terms of guiding approaches that they're actually what is good definitions of energy security are actually about 4 A's, as they're called, not just one, not just availability. It's about access, affordability, acceptability, and availability, and integration must actually mean all 4. Clyde, maybe you need to turn your trifecta into something with 4 parts, but what a good IRP must really ensure: accessibility, equitable infrastructure access must be affordable. This is very important for households. There's been relatively little discussion here around households and what all this means for them, as well as, of course, for firms and industry. It must be acceptable in social terms and certainly in environmental terms, and I will come back, Chris, to the emissions part in particular, but it must be socially and environmentally acceptable, delivering modern energy services for all. And then if we do those things, yes, certainly availability of a secure and reliable electricity supply is what it's all about. And I think Grover really pointed extremely clearly to the legal basis for that. I was struck in reading the IRP, the current draft. I'm not quite sure actually whether it's 2024 or 2025, but the current draft that's going into NEDLAC really not really addressing very much, as I said, in relation to households, also, and also only could find a single reference to the socioeconomic, not to socioeconomic challenge, to job creation, and I think that's really something that is important in this context in terms of the social acceptability in particular. I do want to dig in, as you noted in the introduction. I've spent a lot of time thinking about energy in South Africa and climate change internationally. And so I do want to comment a little bit further on the electricity emissions, and they are frankly ill-defined in the current IRP, and I sympathize with Lebogang. I was also before, in preparing for today, eyeballing a graph on some slides with the CO2 emissions. But even, it's unclear what the axis is there, and I couldn't basically make it out. What is clear and very obvious is that one of the scenarios, the delayed shutdown of coal, will lead to higher emissions, and that's than in the reference case, and that's kind of obvious from anybody who knows anything about climate change. But I would also add, it's important, it's not just about what we build. That is certainly important, but it's also how much we actually run the existing plant. And so that is something that I think is very important to consider, both the new build and the degree to which existing coal plant in particular, because that's really where a very large part of our emissions will come from. It's unclear to me, as I say, what the emissions level implied by the IRP are, and that's a big problem, that it's unclear. If they were eyeballing around 170 megatons, 173 megatons by 2030 is a number I've heard thrown around, that would probably make it difficult to meet our existing NDC target, to stay nationally below 350 megatons. Eskom would basically be taking more than its fair share of a national emissions budget. But the greenhouse gas emissions projection, my main point here really is that the greenhouse gas emissions implications need to be reported much, much more clearly. And one thing that Lebogang, I think, was extremely clear about, and I completely agree with, is that all the analysis that I've seen in this space is that we need to do mitigation in the next 10 years, up to 2035. That's when the end point of the targets in the next NDC that's currently being worked on will be up to, because other than that, apart from the obvious reasons of climate change, while we're doing that, it becomes more expensive, as Lebogang pointed out. So if we basically squander a large part of our national emission budgets now, it's very costly, and it's really unnecessary, because there are cost-effective and technologically viable alternatives that are proven in this sector, which is not the case in other sectors. And I think Clyde's running through the many different options, and particularly his last one, he obviously emphasized the one with high storage and the huge savings is a very good example of that. There's been relatively little discussion, so I wanted to add around the minimum emissions standards. These relate to local air pollutants as distinct from the global greenhouse gas emissions. Frankly, the current IRP is internally contradictory. It has two points that follow each other, basically saying we'll comply with these, and in the very next breath raises a whole lot of challenges. And what that has meant in the past, and seems to signal, is that, in fact, there won't be compliance with those, and that's a very important problem, including very important health effects on communities living near the places where those local air pollutants are produced. I want to move on. So in terms of outcomes, as other speakers have said, I think it has been clear from the other speakers, I don't think that the current draft of the IRP meets the standard of a good IRP in terms of its outcomes. So what about process? The fundamental approach, and several of the speakers spoke to this, should be one of evidence-based policy making, based on clearly stating data and assumptions, indeed more than that, the models and the model structures. And also it's really challenging the way in which, and problematic the way in which scenarios are being used. Scenarios are very widely used, and we use them when we face highly uncertain futures, which is exactly the situation that we have. But in the draft IRP, the scenarios in the beginning, when I was reading around page 10, were about gas at risk, nuclear, delayed shutdown, and an aggressive battery case. And then when it came to the interventions, we again basically you again see gas, delayed shutdown of coal, and a nuclear option. So this really does convey that the scenarios are determining outcomes. And I think Robert's explanation in this respect was really remarkably clear, that this is not a least cost plan, but even more important in terms of the process. It's not, the balance plan is not logically derived. I actually wrote this down. The balance plan is not logically derived from the underlying analysis. That is not just an issue of fragmentation, as the DG spoke about in terms of energy planning. It's more like an exercise in policy-based evidence making. And let me repeat that phrase: policy-based making of evidence is the opposite of what we need, right? It means policy determines what evidence we look for. It must be the other way around, that policy must be based, the plan must be based on strong evidence, and I think that is not the case. One good thing I do like about the current plan, it talks about it as a living plan, and the DG, I think, spoke to that, and other speakers also emphasized the importance of a regular updating of this. In my mind, I think it would be important to have at least 4 steps, possibly more. The first step would be indeed to lay out data assumptions, model structure, and consult around that. Produce some initial findings on scenarios, and scenarios defined as in ways that explore the key uncertainties that we are seeking to manage. Discuss those again, have revised findings, have again consultations. You see the theme of consultation, and only then you actually get to a draft IRP, something that would be published formally by government for last comments and then finalisation. In the end, of course, it is a government plan. But I do think, as this is going for NEDLAC, really all the stakeholders there would do well to demand a better information base from the Department of Electricity and Energy, and draw on independent studies. And Lebogang presented one, but I think there are many of the speakers here, and I imagine amongst the participants would be very willing to contribute to that. Moving to closing off here, but a couple more points, Chris. I think it is important to think about who is making the plan. And what is, I think, very interesting about this moment is that we are seeing a transition from the DMRE to the Department of Electricity and Energy. And I think that creates an important opportunity. And I was interested to hear the DG speaking of moving from a recovery mindset to one of redesign. And I think the redesigning is really, really important. Some have expressed concerns about NEDLAC, but I do think it also is an opportunity, having government, labor, business, and communities in that forum to express differences, thrash them out, and possibly to mediate conflict, to actually build consensus, and then advise the Ministry of Electricity and Energy based on that, and to develop a plan that addresses all 4 of the A's, not just the energy security one, that is transparent and inclusive. And that does these 4 steps, I would say, and we've often commented from UCT in the past, this should happen at least every 2 years. It should be a continuous update. So to achieve such a good IRP, it would need to be fundamentally different in both outcomes and process. And I'll end there. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks, Harold, for those insights. And yeah, your point about it should be, we seem to have policy-based evidence making struck me. I agree with you. I agree with Pravia, and I agree with some of the presenters that have made the point. I think the current draft IRP 2025, currently before NEDLAC, is deeply flawed, both in terms of process and in terms of substance, in terms of collaboration, in terms of consultation, and the way it's been put together. I think it's deeply lacking. I take heart from one thing, I suppose, and that ultimately we're moving from a time of prescriptive IRPs into a period of indicative IRPs, because ultimately Eskom and government don't have the balance sheet to finance this. It relies on external finance, and government and National Treasury does not have the appetite to give government guarantees. And therefore, everything hinges upon the business case of the different proposals. It's easy to put something in an IRP, like 10,000 megawatts of new nuclear power that was in 2010. That never happened. And we're moving to a stage where if it does not make business sense, it will not fly. Because it will have to fly without government guarantees and external investment from lenders, DFIs, commercial banks, insurance companies, and all the provisions of finance will insist on a business case that makes sense for their investment. And so, unless it makes business sense, I just don't see some of the ideas that are put into the IRP as flying. You know, they'll be in there, but they will not happen. So, in a way, the situation is moving to a stage where it just has to make sense, as opposed to being ideologically driven. Easy to put something ideologically into the IRP. It worries me when a Minister of Energy and Electricity says, long before the finalisation of the IRP, long before, he says publicly, there will be significant new nuclear and new gas in the IRP. That really worries me because it presents an ideological position as opposed to a rational position where one's taken after doing a proper socio-economic and socio-techno and economic study like the IRP should be. So I take heart in that, at least, even though the IRP may be deeply flawed. When it finally comes out, it doesn't mean to say it's going to happen. Ladies and gentlemen, it is now 28 minutes past 5, and we are due to end this at 5:30. And I have to say with great reluctance that we're going to have to abandon the Q&A session, although there are many, many excellent questions that remain unanswered. I see a total of 19 answered questions and 41 unanswered questions. But there is no way we are going to be able to deal with 41 questions. We now at 5:30, and we're eating into people's supper time and personal time. So with some reluctance, I'm going to call a close to this. I am going to ensure that the questions are printed out and are sent to the presenters, and I hope that the presenters will be able to answer some of them to those that have posed these questions. So with your permission, I'm going to call an end to this webinar. And I just want to alert you of our next webinar, which will happen on the 5th of June, 2025, in about, well, somewhat over a month away. Is it a month away? What are we, May? No, it's not a month away, less than a month away. But on the 5th of June, we're going to be having a webinar on virtual wheeling. This is a product that is now available from Eskom. We have had a virtual wheeling webinar before, at the time when virtual wheeling was just a concept that still needed to be piloted by Eskom. Well, it has been successfully piloted by Eskom. And Eskom have now announced on their website that this is a product available for customers. It's a very important product, in my view, and customers are asking, what does it mean? How do we get it? How does it work? And what are the risks? And how do we benefit from it? And should we be participating in virtual wheeling? And I think it's a subject that's also very topical, and it will be announced publicly tomorrow, this webinar. Please keep your eyes open for it, and we hope to see you then at our next webinar, dealing with what I think are the important issues of the day in the energy and the electricity sectors. Thank you very much to those organizations that supported this event. In particular, may I thank the Presidential Climate Commission, Stellenbosch University's CRSES, UCT's PRISM, and in the Department of Economics and Meridian Economics, and Clyde Melanson for their support in putting this together and making it all possible. Thanks to the presenters. Thanks also to all of you, the audience, for attending today. It's been a fantastic turnout. It's been a really fascinating discussion, and I do hope that the powers that be will take note of the very serious views of people that are deeply knowledgeable in the field of IRP, and will take to heart what I think is constructive suggestions, constructive criticism. I think Subesh Pillay was very frank in his assessment. He acknowledges many of the problem areas, the fragmented nature of the planning, the fact that we're doing an IRP without an IEP, and the need for evidence-based decision. So I think there is an acknowledgement by the new DG of the weaknesses of the current planning processes and the need to move to a more rational and more carefully thought out planning process that takes us beyond crisis planning into long-term strategic planning, which is what an IRP is all about. So thanks to all those who have been part of this, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, and good night for now.